The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the graveyard. John Carter, a successful millionaire, made his annual visit to his son Ethan's grave, his heart as heavy as the flowers he carried. This day marked the 5th anniversary of the accident, the day he lost Ethan forever. As he approached the grave, he noticed someone standing there. A young man, unfamiliar but strangely connected to this sacred place. John's steps faltered as he drew closer, watching the young man. His clothes were plain, his head bowed in silence. Who was he, and why was he here? John's mind raced with questions. "Excuse me," John finally said, his voice thick with years of suppressed grief. "Did you know my son?" The young man turned slowly, revealing a face marked by sorrow. "Yes," he said softly. "I knew Ethan, in my own way." His response caught John off guard. There was something unspoken in the young man's words, something that tugged at John's heart. He stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. John's eyes scanned the gravestone, but his mind was elsewhere, trying to make sense of this strange encounter. "What do you mean, in your own way?" John asked, his voice more insistent now. The young man looked at him, eyes filled with a sadness John recognized. It was the same sadness that had lived in his own heart for years. "My name is Jake," the young man finally said. "Ethan and we were friends, though we never met in person. This only deepened the mystery. John had never heard Ethan talk about an online friendship. "How could you be friends if you never met?" John asked, a mix of disbelief and intrigue in his tone. Jake took a deep breath, as if the weight of his words carried memories too heavy to bear. "We met online, played video games together, talked for hours. He was like a brother to me, even though we were miles apart. He told me things he never told anyone else. Not even you." John felt a sharp pang in his chest. His son had been distant in the last few years of his life, and John had always blamed their fractured relationship on himself. Hearing this stranger, Jake, speak so intimately about Ethan felt like opening an old wound. "He never mentioned you," John said, more to himself than to Jake. "I know," Jake replied. "He said things were complicated between you two, but he always hoped you'd make up." John clenched his fists, the regret he'd carried for so long bubbling to the surface. Ethan had wanted to fix things, and John had been too proud, too busy, too blind. Now, standing in front of his son's grave, he realized it was too late. The silence between the two men stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. John fought back tears as he looked at the gravestone, then back at Jake. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked down, shifting his weight awkwardly. "Because there's something you need to know, something Ethan wanted to tell you." John's heart raced. "What is it?" he demanded, his grief now mixed with a desperate need for answers. Jake hesitated before finally meeting John's eyes. "The night he died, Ethan was on his way to see you." John's breath caught in his throat. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. "He was coming to see me?" John whispered, his voice trembling. The reality of it struck him like a blow. Ethan had been driving toward reconciliation, and John had never known. His chest tightened with a regret so fierce it made him feel hollow. Jake nodded, his gaze steady but filled with sympathy. "He told me that night. We were playing online, and he said he was done avoiding you. He was going to tell you everything he'd been holding back." John clenched his fists, remembering all the missed calls, the ignored messages. He had no idea that those would be Ethan's last attempts to reach him. "He never made it," John murmured, the familiar ache of loss rising again, but now with a deeper sting. Ethan had wanted to fix their broken relationship, and John had been too stubborn, too consumed with his work and his own pride to realize it. Now he would never get the chance to apologize. "Why didn't I know?" he muttered to himself. Jake's voice broke the silence. "Ethan didn't want to burden you with his problems. He admired you, you know. He looked up to you more than he ever let on." John's eyes filled with unshed tears. The boy standing in front of him seemed to know more about his son's inner world than he ever had. It was like Ethan had lived a whole life John had never been a part of. "He never told me," John said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I didn't know any of this." His voice was thick with regret. Jake looked down at the ground, shuffling his feet. "He wanted to tell you. He just didn't know how." The silence between them was palpable. John looked at the grave, feeling the weight of all the words left unsaid, the time that could never be reclaimed. His eyes, clouded with tears, lingered on Ethan's name etched in stone. "I should have been there for him," John whispered, more to himself than to Jake. "You did what you thought was right," Jake said quietly. But there was a heaviness in his tone, as if he too had felt the burden of John's regret. "Ethan never blamed you, though. He understood. He just wanted you to know he loved you. He just ran out of time." John couldn't hold it in any longer. The tears he had fought so hard to suppress for years finally fell, his shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. "I didn't know," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "I didn't know he was coming to see me that night." Jake placed a hand on John's shoulder, the simple gesture speaking volumes. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I wish things had been different, but maybe you can still honor his memory by knowing that he never stopped loving you." John wiped his eyes, his heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice raw. "Thank you for telling me." The wind blew softly through the trees as John stood in silence, his emotions raw and exposed. Jake remained by his side, offering silent support, his presence a strange comfort. "He was coming to see me," John repeated, the words still sinking in. He glanced at Jake, realizing there was so much more to this young man than just a stranger at his son's grave. "How did you and Ethan become friends?" John asked, breaking the silence. Jake shifted, looking at the gravestone with a fond but sad expression. "It started out simple," Jake explained. "We met online through a game. At first it was just playing around, but after a while, we started talking about life. Ethan, he was easy to talk to." John listened, fascinated and heartbroken at the same time. He never knew his son had made such a close connection with someone he had never even met in person. "He told me things about his life that I don't think he told anyone else," Jake continued. "Things about you, about feeling like he couldn't live up to what you expected of him." John's heart ached. He had never intended to make Ethan feel that way. "I thought I was doing what was best for him," John said quietly. "I just wanted him to be successful, to have everything I never had growing up." Jake nodded. He knew that. "But I think what he really wanted was just more time with you." The words hit John hard. He had spent so much time focusing on building his business, on securing a future for Ethan, that he had missed out on being present in the moment. "I didn't realize," John said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know he felt that way." He looked down, guilt gnawing at him. Jake looked at him with understanding. "We're all just trying to figure things out. Ethan wasn't angry with you, though. He just wanted to be close to you. He talked about it all the time, how he hoped you two could reconnect." John's throat tightened. He had missed his chance to make things right with his son, and now all that was left were memories and regrets. "But now, I'll never get the chance," John whispered. "I'll never be able to tell him I'm sorry." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Jake could feel it too. "Maybe not in person," Jake said softly. but you can still honor him by living the way he wanted, by being the man he admired. John looked up at Jake, surprised by the young man's wisdom. "How did you two get so close?" John asked again, genuinely curious. Ethan always seemed so distant from everyone else. Jake smiled faintly. "We just clicked, I guess. We were both looking for someone to talk to, someone who understood. Ethan, he was like a brother to me." For a moment, John saw his son through Jake's eyes, a kind, thoughtful young man who had touched lives in ways John had never known. "He must have meant a lot to you," John said softly. Jake nodded. "He did, and he still does." John stared at the ground, his mind replaying Jake's words. The weight of his regrets felt heavier than ever, but knowing that Ethan had shared such a bond with Jake brought him a strange sense of peace. "Tell me about that night," John asked, his voice still shaky. "The night he was coming to see me." Jake hesitated for a moment, as if reliving the memory. "It was late," he began. "We were playing a game as usual, but Ethan wasn't himself that night. He sounded different, like something was weighing on him. He finally told me he was going to drive to your house. He said he was ready to fix things between you two." John swallowed hard. He could picture his son sitting at his computer, wrestling with the decision to reach out. "I didn't know he was struggling like that," John whispered. "I missed all the signs." "He didn't want to make you feel guilty," Jake replied. "He thought you had enough on your plate with work and everything. But that night, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. He said he wanted to tell you he loved you, that he was sorry for how things had turned out." John closed his eyes, imagining Ethan getting into his car, his mind full of unspoken words. "What happened next?" John asked, even though he already knew the answer. Jake's face grew solemn. "He never made it," Jake said softly. "The accident. It was sudden. 1 minute we were talking, and the next, he was gone." John's heart clenched. The memory of that night was still fresh in his mind. The phone call, the hospital, the overwhelming numbness that followed. He had never known Ethan was on his way to see him. "I should have picked up the phone," John said bitterly. "I should have called him back. Maybe I could have stopped him." Jake shook his head. "There's no way you could have known," he said gently. "Ethan didn't blame you. He was excited about seeing you. He thought everything was going to be okay after that night." The weight of those words settled on John's shoulders. Everything could have been different if only he had known. "I wasn't a good father," John confessed, his voice breaking. "I spent too much time focused on my business and not enough on Ethan. I didn't even know who he really was." Jake looked at him, sympathy in his eyes. "Ethan didn't hold it against you," he said. "He just wanted to fix things. He loved you no matter what." John wiped a tear from his cheek, his heart heavy with a mixture of grief and guilt. "I wish I could have told him how much I loved him," John said quietly. "I wish I could have made things right." Jake placed a hand on John's shoulder. "Maybe you can still make things right in a different way," he said softly, "by honoring his memory." John stood silently, absorbing Jake's words. There was so much he didn't know about his son, and yet here was this stranger who seemed to carry pieces of Ethan that John had never seen. "Honoring his memory," John echoed softly. "How can I do that when I didn't even know him?" Jake hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "There's something you should have," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out a small object, a worn keychain with the initials EC engraved on it. John's heart skipped a beat. "This was Ethan's," Jake explained. "He sent it to me right before that night." John stared at the keychain, his fingers trembling as he reached out to take it. The weight of it in his hand felt like a connection to his son, something real and tangible in the midst of all the loss. "Why did he give this to you?" John asked, his voice barely steady. Jake smiled sadly. He said it was a reminder that no matter how far apart we were or how difficult things got, we were always connected. I think he wanted you to have it too. John clutched the keychain tightly, feeling the engraved letters under his fingertips. It was a small, simple thing, but it felt like a bridge between him and the son he had lost. "I never knew Ethan kept something like this," John said quietly. "He never showed it to me." Jake nodded, understanding the depth of the pain in John's words. "He was going to give it to you," Jake said softly. The night of the accident, he planned to give you this and tell you everything." John's eyes filled with tears again. This little object, something so small, now held an enormous significance. It was Ethan's way of reaching out, even beyond death. "I don't know what to say," John whispered. He looked up at Jake, who was watching him with quiet understanding. "You don't have to say anything," Jake said gently. "Just know that Ethan never stopped caring about you. He wanted things to be different, and even though he's gone, a part of him is still here." John nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The keychain felt like a piece of his son that he could hold on to, something that connected them across the divide of time and loss. "He would have wanted you to have it," Jake added, "to remind you that it's never too late to make things right, even if it's just in your heart." John swallowed hard, the weight of the keychain pressing into his palm. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for bringing this to me. It means more than you know." John stood there, holding the keychain in his hand, feeling a wave of emotions he hadn't expected. It was as if Ethan was speaking to him through this small token, reminding him of the bond they had shared, even if it had been strained in those final years. "I wish I had known him better," John said quietly, looking down at the ground. "I wish I had been a better father." Jake stood beside him, thoughtful for a moment. "I think you knew him better than you think," Jake said softly. "He talked about you a lot, more than you probably realize." John glanced up at Jake, surprised. "He did?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, he always admired you. He just didn't know how to show it sometimes. But in a lot of ways, he wanted to be like you." John felt a pang in his chest. He had always been so focused on shaping Ethan into the person he thought he should be that he never realized Ethan had already admired him. "I thought he resented me," John confessed. "I thought he hated me for pushing him so hard." Jake shook his head. "He didn't hate you. He just wanted to make you proud in his own way. He didn't want to disappoint you." John's throat tightened as he thought about all the times he had criticized Ethan, trying to push him toward success. "I never told him that I was proud of him," John said, his voice breaking. "Not once." Jake put a hand on John's shoulder. "He knew," Jake said quietly. "He always knew. Even if you didn't say it, he felt it. He just wanted to hear it from you too." John closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his own silence, the unspoken words that had now become permanent. "I don't know how to live with this," John admitted, his voice shaking, "knowing that I'll never get the chance to tell him." Jake looked at him, understanding the depth of his pain. "Maybe you can still tell him," Jake said softly. "Not in words, but in how you live from now on." John looked up at Jake, his eyes filled with questions. "How do you mean?" he asked. Jake smiled faintly. "By being the father you always wanted to be. By living in a way that honors him. Ethan might be gone, but your chance to make things right isn't." John felt a flicker of hope, a small light in the darkness of his grief. "Maybe you're right," John said softly, holding the keychain a little tighter. "Maybe I can still make things right." The silence between John and Jake was comforting now, no longer filled with the sharp edges of regret and loss. John looked at the keychain in his hand and felt something shift inside him. The pain of losing Ethan would never disappear, but perhaps, just maybe, there was a way forward. "I don't know where to begin," John admitted, glancing at Jake. Jake smiled gently. "You've already started," he said. "You're here, facing the truth about what happened, and that's more than most people ever do." John looked at the gravestone, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "I wish I could have one more day with him," John whispered. "Just one more chance to make things right." "I think he would have been proud of you for being here," Jake said, his voice steady and reassuring, "for wanting to make things right, even now." John nodded, but the weight of his failures still pressed on him. "I spent so many years chasing success, trying to provide for him, and in the end, I didn't even give him what he really needed. Me." Jake's expression softened. "We all make mistakes," he said, "but it's not too late to change. You've still got time to be the man Ethan wanted you to be, to live in a way that honors him." John considered Jake's words, letting them sink in. He had spent so long running from his grief, hiding behind work and distractions, but now, standing here with Jake, it felt like there was a path forward, however painful it might be. "Maybe you're right," John said quietly. "Maybe I can still do something good, even if it's too late for Ethan." "It's never too late," Jake said firmly. "Ethan may not be here, but that doesn't mean you can't still make him proud. You have the chance to live differently now, to be the man he knew you could be." John felt the weight of those words, and for the first time in a long time, he believed them. There was still a chance, not to change the past, but to reshape the future. "I want to do that," John said, his voice full of quiet determination. "I want to live in a way that would make him proud." Jake smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. "That's all Ethan ever wanted," Jake said. "For you to be happy, for you to live your life with purpose." John looked back at the grave, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The pain was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Hope. "Thank you," John said softly, "for being here, for telling me the things I never knew." John stood for a moment longer at Ethan's grave, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and hope. He had come here every year, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just visiting the past, he was finally looking toward the future. "I wish I could have done things differently," John said, his voice soft but steady. "But maybe now I can." Jake, standing beside him, nodded. "You can," he replied. "Ethan wouldn't want you to stay stuck in the past. He'd want you to move forward, to live your life." John considered those words, letting them sink in. For so long, he had been living in the shadow of his regrets, unable to let go of the guilt that had consumed him. "I've been stuck," John admitted, more to himself than to Jake. "I've been holding on to this idea that I could somehow fix things, but I never realized that the only way to fix it is to move on." Jake looked at him with quiet understanding. "Moving on doesn't mean forgetting," he said. "It means honoring his memory by living fully." John turned to Jake, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "You've given me more than you know," John said. This conversation, this keychain, it's like a gift from Ethan." Jake smiled. "Maybe it is," he said. "Maybe Ethan knew you needed this even if it took a while for you to get here." John looked down at the keychain, turning it over in his hand. It was a simple thing, but it represented so much more. A connection to his son, a reminder of the love that had always been there, even when it wasn't spoken. "I'm going to try," John said, his voice resolute. "I'm going to live differently, for Ethan and for myself." Jake smiled, the kind of smile that felt like a shared understanding. "I think that's exactly what he'd want," Jake said. And you're not alone in this. You've got people around you who care, even if you don't always see it. John nodded, feeling the truth of Jake's words. For so long he had isolated himself, thinking that his grief was something he had to bear alone. But now he realized that healing didn't have to happen in isolation. "Thank you, Jake," John said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." "You don't have to thank me," Jake replied. "Ethan brought us together for a reason. Maybe this is part of his legacy too." John smiled faintly, feeling the weight of those words. Ethan's legacy wasn't just in the past. It was something that could continue, something that could shape the lives of those who loved him. As John and Jake walked away from the grave, the quiet between them felt comforting. John's mind was racing, but for the first time in years, it wasn't filled with guilt or regret. Instead, it was filled with possibilities, ways to honor Ethan, ways to move forward without forgetting the past. "What now?" John asked, almost to himself. Jake glanced at him, sensing the shift in John's mood. "You keep going," Jake said simply. "One day at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now." John nodded, letting the simplicity of Jake's words sink in. He had spent so much time trying to fix things that he had forgotten how to just live. "It's strange," John said quietly. "I always thought healing would come from fixing what was broken. But maybe it's more about accepting it." Jake smiled faintly. "Ethan used to say the same thing," he said, "that sometimes things don't need to be fixed, they just need to be understood." John's heart ached at the thought of his son, so wise and yet so misunderstood by the very person who should have known him best. "I wish I had listened to him more," John admitted, his voice soft with regret. "I wish I had seen who he really was, instead of who I wanted him to be." Jake nodded, understanding the depth of John's words. "It's never too late to start seeing him now," Jake said, "through the memories, through the people he touched." John looked at Jake, realizing that this young man was one of those people, someone who had known Ethan in a way John never had. "I'm glad you told me about him," John said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I think I needed to hear it more than I realized." Jake's smile was gentle but sincere. "I'm glad I could be here," he said. "Ethan brought us together for a reason. Maybe this is part of his story too." John nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. "Maybe it is," he agreed. "Maybe this is how we keep his story going, by living the way he would have wanted us to live." As they reached the edge of the cemetery, John paused for a moment, looking back at Ethan's grave. The pain was still there, but it no longer felt like a weight dragging him down. Instead, it felt like a reminder that love and loss were intertwined, and that healing didn't mean forgetting. As they left the cemetery, John felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. There was still pain, still loss, but now it felt bearable, as if he had been given a second chance, not to change the past, but to live differently in the future. "I've been thinking," John said, breaking the silence. "I need to do more than just move forward. I need to find a way to honor Ethan's memory." Jake looked at him, curiosity in his eyes. "What do you have in mind?" John thought for a moment, the wheels turning in his head. "Ethan always cared about helping people, didn't he? I didn't see it before, but now I understand. I want to do something meaningful, something that would have made him proud." Jake smiled, sensing the determination in John's voice. "I think he would have liked that," Jake said. "What kind of thing are you thinking about?" John sighed, feeling the weight of the decision, but also a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in years. "Maybe I can start a foundation," he said, "something to help young people who need guidance, who don't have the support Ethan had." Jake's smile widened. "That sounds like something Ethan would have loved," he said. "He was always talking about helping others, especially people who felt alone." John nodded, feeling a spark of inspiration. I spent so many years focused on the wrong things, money, success, reputation, but now I see that none of that matters if you don't make a difference. Jake's voice softened. Ethan made a difference, he said quietly. In my life, in the lives of others he touched. And now, through you, he can continue to do that. John felt a swell of emotion in his chest. I'm going to do it, he said, more to himself than to Jake. I'm going to create something in his name, something that helps kids who need a hand. It's what Ethan would have wanted. Jake nodded, his eyes shining with approval. That's a beautiful way to honor him, Jake said, and I'm sure he's proud of you for even thinking of it. John felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of purpose taking root. For so long, he had been lost in his grief, but now he could see a way forward, a way to turn that grief into something meaningful. It's time, John said, his voice firm. It's time to stop living in the past and start building something for the future. The days that followed were filled with purpose. John couldn't shake the idea of honoring Ethan by creating something that would help others. He poured himself into the idea, researching, planning, and drafting out the foundation that would bear Ethan's name. It was the first time in years that he felt truly alive, as though he were reconnecting with the spirit of his son through this new endeavor. Jake had become a constant presence during this time, offering his own insights and support. Ethan always talked about how he wished there were more resources for kids like me, Jake said one afternoon as they sat together in John's office. Kids who don't have strong family support or who feel lost. John nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what I want this foundation to be, he said. A place where young people can find the guidance they need, where they won't feel alone. For the first time, John wasn't just working for himself. He was working for something bigger, something that would make Ethan proud. Together, they began sketching out the details: scholarships, mentorship programs, and outreach initiatives for struggling youth. Every step felt like a tribute to the son John had lost. I wish I could have done this while he was still here, John admitted, the weight of his regret still present but softer now. Jake looked at him, understanding in his eyes. You're doing it now, he said. That's what matters. You're turning your grief into something that can help others. That's the greatest tribute you could give him. John smiled faintly, feeling the truth in Jake's words. For years, he had been lost in the past, but now, for the first time, he was looking toward the future. I just hope I'm doing it right, John said, his voice filled with uncertainty. You are, Jake reassured him. Ethan would have been proud. He always wanted to make the world a better place. Now, through you, he can. As the weeks passed, the foundation began to take shape. John worked tirelessly, fueled by the desire to create something that would outlast him, something that would carry Ethan's spirit forward. It's like he's still here with me, John confided to Jake one evening as they looked over the plans. I feel like I'm finally getting to know him, even now. Jake smiled softly. In a way you are, he said. You're learning who Ethan was by carrying out his dreams. You're keeping him alive through every life you touch. As the foundation grew, so did John's sense of connection, not just to Ethan, but to life itself. He began reaching out to old friends, mending relationships he had neglected over the years. He realized that his drive for success had not only cost him time with Ethan, but with others as well. Now, with Ethan's memory as his guide, John was determined to live differently. One afternoon, as he and Jake sat discussing the latest updates to the foundation, John's phone buzzed. It was a message from an old colleague he hadn't spoken to in years. Funny how life works, John mused, glancing at the message. I've been so focused on the wrong things for so long. I pushed everyone away, and now they're reaching out when I need them most. Jake looked up from the papers they were reviewing. Maybe this is part of the healing too, he said. Reconnecting with the people you've lost along the way. John nodded, feeling a deep sense of truth in Jake's words. The foundation had given him a new sense of purpose, but it was also helping him rebuild the relationships he had let slip through his fingers. I think Ethan would have wanted this, John said, his voice filled with quiet reflection. For me to reconnect with the world, not just through the foundation, but through the people who were always there. Jake smiled. You're not just building a legacy for him, you're building one for yourself too, he said. A life that matters, one that's full of meaning, and not just success. John felt a warmth spread through him. For the first time, he wasn't running from his grief. He was embracing it, using it to fuel a life that would honor his son in every way. I never thought I'd find peace after losing Ethan, John admitted, his voice soft but steady. But now, I feel like I'm finally starting to. Jake nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. Peace doesn't mean the pain is gone, he said. It just means you've learned to live with it, to use it in a way that helps you grow. John looked at Jake, feeling an immense gratitude for the young man who had become such an important part of his life. I'm glad you're here, John said sincerely. I don't think I could have done this without you. Jake smiled, his expression warm. I'm glad too, he said. I think we were both meant to meet, to help each other heal. As time passed, John found himself not just healing, but growing through the friendship he had formed with Jake. Their bond had deepened, not just through their shared grief over Ethan, but through the understanding and support they offered each other. Jake had become like a son to John, filling a void that had once seemed impossible to heal. One evening, as they sat together after another day of work on the foundation, John turned to Jake. You know, John began, his voice thoughtful, you've done more for me than you realize. I think Ethan brought us together for a reason. Jake smiled, his eyes reflecting the warmth of their connection. I feel the same way, he said. Ethan meant a lot to me, but through him, I found something even more meaningful, a second family. John's heart swelled at the words. It was strange, how life had a way of bringing unexpected blessings out of the deepest pain. I never imagined I'd find someone like you, especially after losing Ethan, John admitted. But now it feels like I've gained another son. Jake's smile widened, his eyes bright with emotion. I feel like I've gained a father, he said softly. The bond they shared had grown into something neither of them had expected, but both had needed. It wasn't about replacing Ethan, but about finding a new way forward, together. The foundation was thriving, helping countless young people who, like Jake, had felt lost or unsupported. And through it all, John and Jake had found their own healing, one that went beyond the foundation's mission. It was personal, a bond built on love, loss, and the desire to honor Ethan's legacy. You know, John said one day as they looked over the latest updates from the foundation, I think this is exactly what Ethan would have wanted. Not just the foundation, but this, us, working together, healing together. Jake nodded, his expression full of quiet pride. He always wanted you to be happy, Jake said. I think he'd be proud to see how far you've come. John felt a lump form in his throat, but it wasn't the familiar weight of grief. It was something softer, something filled with hope. I am happy, John said quietly. Happier than I've been in years. And a lot of that is thanks to you. Jake smiled, his heart full. We've both helped each other, he said. That's what family does. The bond between John and Jake had become something neither of them had expected, a family born from shared grief and healing. But there was one more thing John had to confront before he could fully move forward, forgiving himself. It was a journey he had resisted for years, clinging to the guilt and regret of his past mistakes. But now, standing at the edge of this new chapter, He knew it was time. One evening, as they sat together after a long day working on the foundation, John broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his eyes distant. "I've spent so many years blaming myself for what happened to Ethan, for not being the father he needed." Jake looked at him, his expression serious but understanding. "You did what you thought was right at the time," Jake said. "None of us are perfect. Ethan knew that, and he loved you anyway." John nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I know that now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's taken me so long to accept it. I've been punishing myself, holding on to this guilt, thinking it was the only way to keep him close." Jake placed a hand on John's shoulder. "You don't need to punish yourself anymore," he said softly. "Ethan wouldn't want that. He'd want you to find peace, to forgive yourself." John looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "I've held on to this for so long, it feels like part of me." Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," he said. "It's about accepting that you did your best with what you knew at the time. And it's about letting go of the things you can't change." John's eyes filled with tears. "I want to let go," he whispered. "I want to stop carrying this weight. But I don't know how." Jake squeezed his shoulder. "You start by forgiving yourself," he said. "One day at a time. You've already taken the first step by honoring Ethan's memory. Now, it's time to honor yourself." John looked at Jake, the young man who had become a lifeline in his darkest moments. "I'll try," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll try to forgive myself, for Ethan and for me." The sun was setting as John stood at Ethan's grave once more, the keychain with Ethan's initials held tightly in his hand. Jake stood beside him, the quiet between them filled with the unspoken bond they now shared. This visit felt different from the others. There was still grief, still pain, but now it was mixed with a deep sense of peace. "I think I finally understand," John said softly, looking down at the gravestone. "It's not about fixing the past. It's about moving forward with love. That's the legacy Ethan left behind." Jake nodded, his gaze steady. "He would have wanted you to find peace," he said. "And now, you have a chance to live the way he always hoped you would." John smiled, though his eyes were misted with tears. "I'm going to keep the foundation going," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I'm going to keep helping people, the way Ethan would have wanted, and I'm going to live a life that honors him, but also honors the man I want to be." Jake's smile mirrored John's. "You're already doing that," he said. "Every day, you're living that legacy." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the years between them and Ethan felt, but now it wasn't a burden. It was a reminder of love, of connection, of the power of forgiveness. "I miss him," John whispered, his voice trembling, "but I feel like he's still with me, in everything I do." Jake nodded. "He is," Jake said quietly, "and he always will be." As they turned to leave the cemetery, John felt lighter than he had in years. The foundation was flourishing, and more importantly, John had found a new purpose in his life, one that honored Ethan's memory but also allowed him to embrace the future. "I think Ethan would be proud of us," John said as they walked toward the gate. Jake smiled. "I know he would be." Together they walked away from the grave side by side, not as strangers brought together by tragedy, but as family bound by love. The future was uncertain, but it was filled with hope, and that was enough.